So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining today. So we'll be looking at starting learning outcome 4, and learning outcome 4 today, concentrates on being able to essentially, develop a human resource strategy. So what we've learned so far in terms of theoretical outcomes, what we want to be able to do is actually put this into a bit of practice. And it says can develop a human resource strategy for an organization. Now, this has two assessment criteria. One, we are looking at developing a plan for a named organization. I think that's an important part because this will translate into an activity in the assignment brief. And at some stage, what you'll need to do is obviously use your own organization at work or choose an organization that you're familiar with. And that should allow you to essentially, then put this plan into action. So looking at hypothetically developing an HR plan, assuming we are an HR manager, we put on that hat, then the idea would be to develop a plan for the organization for a year or, for a plan which could be a short-term plan or a long-term plan, but essentially a plan that will allow you to, showcase what you've learned and how you put this together. The second assessment criteria looks at explaining how the proposed resource management strategy will support business objectives. So this would be an add-on to the task 4.1, wherein we are looking at in this criteria discussing how the business plan supports the organizational strategy. So basically the detailing of the plan to show synergy between what the organization plan is and how the HR plan supports the achievement of that strategy of the organization. So if you take an example of maybe the company is looking at expanding into 10 locations or starting 10 new outlets this year, for example, if it's a restaurant chain or example, it's a fast food chain and they want to expand to and have 10 more locations, then that is the organizational plan. Then how would the HR plan support that organizational plan or strategy is what you will need to detail out in 4.2. The last assessment criteria that we look at is the distinction one, talks about, what could be the discussion on what could be the potential barriers which would impede the implementation of that plan. That means barriers that you could face as an HR manager. Say, for example, shortage of skilled manpower. It could be legislation from the employee, or it could be, say, for example, training and development because you're not able to, or the learning curve required for the staff to be able to get into their roles might be longer or, let's say harder, and in such case training and development would be required to be spent. And in some cases it could be a potential barrier that you're able to find resources but they are not, when I say you're able to find people to be able to take up that position, but the plan requires stretching budgets because compensation by competition or salary structures by competition or your salary structures that you put together are not in line with the market. So there could be n number of such barriers. In some countries, the barriers could be, for example, recruitment or bringing in expats from their own location, which would mean visa restrictions or compliance with employment laws and legislations in that country, and those could be potential barriers that we could discuss. So, all in all, a practical learning outcome today, which is basically focused on covering two main assessment criteria and then looking at discussing what could be the barriers that we could face. And that could be financial barriers as well, which is compensation, trade union barriers, skills availability or shortage, resistance to change. Sometimes if you're implementing something in the organization and people are not willing to accept change, staff is not willing to accept change, lack of alignment, if the strategy is slightly not aligned, with the organizational strategy, communication can be seen as a bottleneck. So there are lots of different points which typically would be, or I would say, can be deemed as potential barriers, and they would be in the discussion that we will do primarily in this last distinction criteria. Now, let's start off, as always, with a bit of a key terminology or discussion on the overarching message of the learning outcome. Now, overarching message of the learning outcome, if I look at, and I put it this way, is basically to discuss, can we develop a human resource strategy for an organization? So if we were to look at, just basically focusing on the aspect of what do we mean by human resource strategy, or in general just talk about the keywords, which is typically looking at by breaking down the keywords in the learning outcome. The keyword in the learning outcome is human resource strategy. Now, human resource strategy is also called the people strategy in some organizations because there could be different terms and meanings of how you address it. But generally speaking, if you have a chief people's officer or a chief HR officer, HR would call it HR strategy. If you have a people's officer, it's normally called the people's strategy in some cases. So when we look at a human resource strategy, what is it? It is essentially going to be a plan or a set of activities that the HR department and the team would put in place primarily to ensure that it is able to better manage the employees, and that better management of employees, whether it's for efficiency, productivity, getting them to achieve the targets or the long-term, short-term goals, would be known as what is called the HR strategy. Now, in order to put this strategy in place, HR person also needs to have a very good understanding of what the overall progress the management or the board is trying to get for the organization. Big, small, large, medium, doesn't matter, but there should be an alignment in terms of understanding the overarching goals of the organization. Now, whether these goals are short term or long term, but at the end of the day, these goals have to be understood by each and every employee working within the organization. And this tends to be done through the process of what is called policies and procedures, which HR brings out. And in order to make sure that the policies and procedures are effective, HR looks at aligning all its activities that it does. All the activities, when I say, include recruitment, selection, training, development, talent management, remuneration, reward management. You look at succession planning, all the things like union action, anything to do with, activities which involve HR's role in driving the organization forward would be the activities that they would need to consider are all well aligned with the organizational strategy. That means the HR is supporting by creating policies and procedures which are going to be coherent, but at the same time, these are going to be aligned with the organizational long term goals. That means this department will work in unison with the directions provided by the board or the management under all circumstances. And on top of it, it would need to do its basic part in terms of ensuring that it is aligning whatever it creates as a manual, as a process, as a policy, that it aligns and obviously complies with legal and regulatory compliances. It minimizes the policies and obviously the procedures it creates, it minimizes disruption and obviously helps in creating a positive work environment. That positive work environment would typically be inclusive of things like a correct structure for the organization. It would include propagating a culture through the policies, processes, let's say schemes that it comes out with, and it promotes a motivating culture in the organization from a perspective of employees, and that would be the key purpose of HRM strategy, because at the end of the day, their main aim is to look at ensuring that they have the right staff which have the skills and abilities to be able to help in completing and achieving the objectives. They are able to understand their policies and procedures, are able to make people understand what are the goals of the organization, how these goals align with the performance and management of their roles in the company. And then these goals, when individuals achieve their goal, they achieve the goals for the team. When team achieves the goal, it achieves it for the department. When the departments achieve their goal, they achieve it for the organization. So this particular management, what the HR does, is primarily going to be the HR part of that is the role which they play. And this role, which can be seen in helping to achieve the long-term strategy of the organization, would be termed as the HR strategy. Now, there is a very good video again, which I've shortlisted, which basically helps you get introduced to the process of how an HR strategy is formed and what all are the elements of that particular strategy. Now, yesterday we discussed in Learning Outcome 3, if you recall, that we looked at evaluating the key elements of human resource strategy. So the activities of human resource department at some stage become the elements of the human resource strategy. And here, this video, which is a 20-minute, approximately a 21-minute watch, essentially would give you a very detailed understanding of, if you were to wear the HR manager's role and hat and get into their shoes for an organization, for a startup, if you're given this responsibility within the organization, then what are the bits that you would take into account to create a strategy which works and helps the organization achieve its overall goals and objectives. So those bits is, explained visually quite well in this particular video. And that's what I would say, at some stage you would need to look at and go through in terms of, understanding this particular learning outcome, in detail. Now, what we are going to do is obviously look at, developing and understanding this particular part of the strategy that we need to do by looking at some of the main aspects of what is it that it actually involves in terms of when we say developing a strategy. Now, there are a couple of things, obviously, sometimes when we start off with in the organization, when we talk about developing a strategy. In general, let's forget HR strategy for a minute, but in general, if you have to plan something which is going to help in the achievement of goals and objectives, at some stage, the organization looks at some sort of, let's say, an introspection into what is going right, what is going wrong, what are the things that they are missing, or in some cases, when I say missing, they want to look at market intel and obviously find out how in general the market is, or market factors are affecting the organization in the achievement of those objectives. So if I look at the formation of strategy for any purpose, whether it's marketing, sales, product, engineering, you look at R&D, you look at, for example, HR, financial side of things, every strategy would involve some basic steps. Now, these basic steps would typically include some sort of an introspection. Now, introspection, I would say, if I relate it now to a word or a model that we would discuss, would be, say, SWOT analysis, because what the organization wants to do is understand what they do good, what they don't do that good, what are the opportunities that they can look at expanding into, and what could be the areas of threat because of competition activity, market factors, government policy and legislation, and in general, the economic climate. Now, that analysis that we conduct in terms of SWOT would give the company a starting point in terms of finding out where are they looking at opportunities for expansion, for example, or what are the threats which are going to be impeding the business or competing with them in the market, and that would kind of impede the business in short term or long term. Now, that tends to be the more or less the first step, which is what most companies start off with. Then they look at, once they know what is good, what is bad, where are things missing, and what could be the things that they need to do to achieve, say, for example, goals. Then in those cases, after that, the second step normally tends to be developing a plan. And that plan could involve a number of activities. That plan could mean you define some objectives, you define some goals, you look at previous objectives. If there was a previous plan which was put in place, how many of them were achieved? If some of them are ongoing, then you take them on in the current plan, and then obviously develop them further to enhance it for the next couple of years. So if you look at some sort of planning which the departments do, or which you do in your role, at some stage would look at finding out how you're doing in the current context. Then you look at, looking at planning for the future. And then after planning that you've done a comprehensive planning, then at some stage you look at putting together an implementation plan. That means how this plan or proposed set of activities which have been discussed, agreed, would be put into action. Now, at some stage, this plan could then follow once you've started to implement this and it has been broken down into individual documents or handouts which different departments would understand and carry forward. At some stage, when you've had this plan working for 2, 3, 4 months, weeks, depending on how long or what is the plan for short term, medium term, long term, you at some stage would look at monitoring and evaluation, that whether the plan is going whether the activities are going as per the plan or not. Are they leading to some sort of an output, which is what we have expected in the planning side of things? And that would be something that you would look at in monitoring and evaluation. Now, seldom it does happen that these activities do not go as planned. So in some cases, when you do the checks and if you find that these are not going as what has been planned in the part of activities, then you readjust, refine, or basically readjust and refine the plan. I would put it this way. Now, readjustments can be done because if it is an example that I gave at the start is that we are looking at expanding or opening 10 new outlets for the business. If the economic environment or there is a downturn in the environment or there's a slowdown in the markets, then you might want to scale down some of the expansion plans, and that would be adjusting it, refining it basis the market conditions that you find. And last but not the least, what you then tend to do is primarily look at, going back and readjusting to ensure that the plan is being put in place. There are resources, financial, human, administrative, and any sort of other resource that is required is available to be able to put that plan in place. And you keep monitoring, keep adjusting, keep refining it so that you are able to then meet the objectives why this plan was formed. And at some stage, what you would also then do is basically at the end of it, if the implementation has come to an end or if the implementation is not going smooth, then you also look at evaluating what are called any obstacles which are being faced or any, I would say, um, you know, um, obstacles or hurdles which are essentially coming across in the implementation of that plan would also need to be considered. In some cases, you would need to go back to management because there are obstacles which are financial obstacles, or if the costs are increasing or what has been budgeted for, then you would need further, you would go back to the management and seek further approvals and things like that. Now, that in general tends to be how you create a plan. So you start with introspection, do analysis on the current situation, then you go into firming up clear objectives and define a plan that would consist of a number of activities. At some stage, you would look at implementation of the plan. You'll define the steps for implementation. After the implementation starts, you start monitoring and evaluating the plan. If there are things not going right or if things need to be adjusted or refined, you would look at adjustment and refinement to that plan. And then at a last stage, you would also start to look at if there are any hurdles, obstacles, barriers that you're facing in the implementation of that plan in any part of the department or the organization, and then seek solutions, whether it's solutions coming from the management, the board, the team itself, and provide those solutions to be able to overcome barriers, and that leads to a successful implementation of the plan. Now, this part of planning that we do, when it is done for short, medium, or long-term goals, and that also looks at achieving organizational objectives and thereby helping achieve the goals and objectives set for each and every individual in terms of the individuals in terms of working with the departments and departments achieving their plan. At some stage, this would help the overall company grow, and the growth could come in the form of market share, profitability, bottom line, increase in customer base, improvement in quality of products, or in terms improvement in revenue being generated from existing customers, more revenue being generated. So depending on how the growth strategy or success for the plan has been defined in short, medium, and long term, and these set of activities that you carry out would then form what is called a strategy. Because you know that once this plan has been firmed up, these set of activities work. Every now and then, these set of activities are refined and they are put into play again, and they would then become a strategy. Now, if we look at a plan which is long term, because strategy is generally long term, so long term in organizations tend to be nowadays 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year. So in some cases, if I look at sustainability, or in some cases, if we look at a hotel industry, for example, and they look at targets which normally industry has to follow because of regulation. For example, the retail industry in the European region have been asked to be self-sustaining for production of electricity, or requirements related to sending less waste to landfill looking at water conservation and sustainability targets under all these. These are all sustainability targets: sending less material to landfill, being more eco-friendly, reducing the carbon emissions. There could be various other forms of sustainability, but these targets which are to be met now have been used by HR, and they have been developed into a long-term organizational plan. And HR has taken these long-term organizational plans and added it to the key parts of the roles which some of the employees do within the organization. And because this is a long-term plan, it cannot happen over a short point of time. This tends to constitute what is called a strategy. Now, this is what we need to understand in the overarching understanding of the learning outcome that we are reading today, which is human resource management strategy for an organization. So, in general, some of the slides that are put together now basically discuss and detail it out from an HR perspective. What does developing an HR strategy mean? But you go through the same basic steps of what I've explained when a strategy is to be formed in any part of the organization, whether it's HR strategy, marketing strategy, financial strategy. They will have the same hooks that you would need to have, or headings that you would need to have in order to develop that. So things like conducting first is to understand the need analysis, then do a SWOT analysis, look at internal, external factors, then define clear objectives. And then once the clear objectives have been defined, you need to look at developing plans or action plans, which could be related to certain elements of the HR strategy. So if you're looking at streamlining workforce, reducing the workforce, creating a high skilled workforce, these are all different objectives. The process of elements, when I say process, elements of the HR strategy would include recruitment and selection. That means you recruit people with high skills, you recruit people essentially with good experience within that particular role, and that would help you in developing a highly skilled workforce. And once these plans are agreed and sanctioned, you then start looking at the implementation. So implementation would involve further detailing of that plan, which could be done for the departmental level, from the department. It could be done for the employee level. Clear sets of communication needs to be established so that everybody sings from the same songbook, everybody has the same understanding of the plan. And then once these plans are put into place, they start being implemented. You look at monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation would include regularly checking on the key performance indicators of each of the activities which have been defined. So if we are saying that there are 10 outlets that the company wants to expand or open, I'm looking at a fast food chain, for example, Subway, they keep expanding and opening outlets across the year. But what they do is they choose the area, they choose the location very, very carefully, because they want to look at demand in that location for their products and services in order to sustain that particular store, and look at adding it to the overall sales of a region for a number of years. And that is not something which can be taken lightly. So in such cases, they regularly look at reading into retail reports, development plans with the council, how the area is coming up in terms of regeneration, or for example, the population statistics, and in general, look at how the retail activity is happening within that particular area before they decide on, choosing that location as an outlet. So in such cases, you would look at the key performance indicators of the area. But apart from that, once you start implementation of that plan, you would look at what are the key performance indicators in terms of the employees that you recruit, or the money that you're spending in terms of training and development, and whether this is leading to employees being more productive and efficient. And then if things are not going as planned, as I mentioned, you adjust and refine your strategy. And that would mean in some cases, some processes might need to change, some planning side of things might need to be adjusted, budgets might need to be increased because of changing market conditions, or in some cases, you would need to look at, maybe bringing something entirely new, which would have not been anticipated at the time of planning, because there are changes in the market and these external factors are asking or mandating you to look at those requirements now. And in such cases, adjustment and refinement needs to happen. Now, once you've firmed up the plan, as I discussed yesterday, we looked at what are the elements of that plan. So elements of the plan tend to be the key set of activities which HR does. And they tend to be 7 or 8 different types of activities, whichever way we look at. the HR planning process. So if I look at showing you an image of HR planning process or some of the activities, which HR does, that set of activities pretty much remains the same whether we look at say, for example, any sort of planning which the HR side of things does. And that side of planning which the HR does essentially reflects on each of the individual elements which they need to look at, from a point of view of the activities that they need to look at um, implementing or putting into place, because they are going to be the activities which the department actually carries out. So these set of activities, when we talk about, tend to be things like recruitment and selection. They tend to be, training and development. They tend to be rewards management, performance appraisals of it, job descriptions that they get into and create. And these side of things typically tend to be related to helping the HR create what is called the HR planning side of things. So when we do look at the basic bits of what they do, when you look at recruitment and selection, it could be something that we term in a small organization. But when we look at a large organization wherein the employees are set and there are a number of people working in different departments, and maybe 200, say 250 employees, medium to large organization, you would call it workforce planning, because they would then be looking at optimizing, the output of the workforce in terms of some of the functions which workforce carries out, and they would be the set of functions that I would say, HR looks at. So this particular image, depends on how you want to look at it, but this particular diagram or an image that I put together actually shows the set of activities which could be encompassing the activities of an HR department in any organization. Now, size and scale, and obviously number of employees in the organization would depict that some activities would be specific to specific organizations, but in general, key 5 or 6 activities tend to be now a part and parcel of any department and any HR role within any company. So they start with things like human resource planning. You look at recruitment and selection, performance management, learning and development, career planning or succession planning. You look at evaluation in terms of refining job descriptions or key performance indicators. You look at reward management in larger organizations where you have unions, lots of workers working within factories, or essentially a location like call center wherein there are lots of workers involved. You would generally see in services sector, you have the option wherein employees can take up union membership, and in such cases, management of union memberships and relationships in general revolves around labor relations or industrial relations. And then you have employee participation and communication, which is to look at surveys, feedbacks. You have health and safety, which is also a key part that the HR is responsible for providing a health and safety perspective, which is a safe working environment for all employees within all locations wherever they work. And in recent years, what we have seen is the mental health, well-being, and the well-being side of things also coming into play, which has become a part and parcel of the HR activities. So this is another facet of the activities which has come into the HR functions. And then they have administrative responsibilities, which could be payroll, which could be, say, for example, usual set of activities which the HR department does, looking at after leaves, or for example, sanctioning of leave, and maintaining certain key operational activities which are, I would say, administrative functions. They would generally then form a part of the larger set of functions which HR does within an organization. So some of them, when we say what are the elements that HR uses, or what are the key components of the strategy, the key components of the strategy are essentially the basic set of activities which HR carries out. And that is what I've listed here in this slide. So in all organizations, generally, you would see 6 or 7 of these activities being a part and parcel of, what the HR is expected to do. And when I say, just as a very different example, if you say you are in the plumbing trade or electrician, you're in an electrician, then main set of things that you do in your function is that you look after activities that would be looking after drainage, leaks, fixing leaks or drainage, or, installation of new equipment, or, things within the toiletry side of things. Now, those are the bits of skills that you have, and that the activities that you carry out with those skills would be installing a sink, fixing a leak and things like that. And that is where the elements of your skills come into play. So similarly, when I look at HR, you're looking at the set of activities which HR does, functions which HR does, and how these functions essentially help in driving the job that you do, or the activities that you do, would be termed as the elements of the HR strategy. So this table towards the end I've used to summarize what are the various elements that you look at from a strategy point of view, what is their purpose, and given a very brief example qualitatively to make you understand that each of these elements essentially contribute towards the creation, I would say, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and then adjustment of the strategy to ensure that the aims and objectives align with the overall organizational strategy. Is that okay? Any questions on this?
All good, Raman.
Asad, any questions at your end? Okay, good stuff. Now, let's look at the first assessment criteria, which talks about developing a human resource strategy for a named organization. So what we've done here is I have taken up my own company as the named organization, because one of the key parts of the task or the assessment criteria is we don't need to discuss this descriptively or theoretically. We need to discuss it by taking an organization into account, or by taking an example of an organization and then discussing how do we develop a human resource strategy. Now, the idea of taking an organization here is to have an understanding of the organization as well, because you would need to understand which sector they operate in, what are their how they work within and offer their services in the market, what could be the organizational structure and culture within the organization, and the number of employees which work within that organization, and that would help you to put a strategy in place. Now, as you know, that we are obviously an online college and an online education provider. We are providing a range of higher educational and professional courses, and the idea there is the key USP of the organization is that we are able to provide these courses which are flexible, and these courses are off-call approved, and they are allowing learners to be able to do or complete education to go on to achieve even degrees at the universities, after completion of courses with us. Now, they are affordable. They are, at a price which is affordable for consumers. And because of the flexibility it provides through the delivery of the courses online, it creates, let's say, it has a position in the market wherein it is attractive to a lot of learners, globally. Now, with this in mind, when we look at our background, and because we are set up as an online college, what we want to be able to look at is how do we get and attract the best possible talent to be able to come in and work within the organization. So that is the challenge to develop a HR strategy. That how do we look at retaining, how do we look at attracting the best possible talent who would come in and work within the organization. Now, this talent could come in and work within 2 or 3 different types of roles. Some of them could come in and work within administration, some of them could come in and work within operations, and some of them could be working and operating within the teaching and learning side of things. So when we look at this from an HR perspective, which is one of my colleagues' opinion, he looks at creating a strategy which will allow us as an organization to attract the best possible talent in terms of teaching lecturers, in terms of operational, which is running the day-to-day operations of the organization, and then student support administrators or people working within the administration who would basically understand their job role and functions and carry out them quite well, effectively, to be able to deliver these services to the learners who are actually doing courses with us. Now, when the HR strategy has to be developed, what models do we follow? Or what models do we what models we see deemed fit within the organization of, say, UK Versity. So here the two models that we look at, which we feel are fit for developing a strategy. One is the contingency approach model, because of the fact that we work in a highly competitive landscape and there are things which are always evolving. The contingency model tends to provide us what is called a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach. And here it allows us to adjust to the changing requirements of the market as well as the learners, and that keeps us in line with what we offer and obviously attract learners who want to do courses with us. So contingency model is the model that we use and we depend on most because of the fact that we operate in an environment and a landscape which is continuously changing and evolving. And that is where this allows UK Versity to dynamically adjust to both competition as well as the changing landscape, which is basically the specifications or changes in courses which is being introduced by Ofqual from time to time and the awarding bodies, and that works quite well with regards to our strategy. So most of our strategy tends to be, short term, which is 6 to 12 months, 12 to 18 months, generally, I would say, and that would mean this particular model fits well. Now, when we look at the teaching and learning side of things, the contingency model works because there are always changing guidelines from awarding bodies, and we need to keep adapting to it and have workforce which is able to adapt and flexibly adapt to these policies to incorporate them in the teaching and learning that they deliver. The best practice model I look at is primarily because it allows the staff which is going to be more consistently engaged in some of these activities in administration and operation to work well, because here some of these things and operations which are set do not change that often. They only need to be maintained, and the effectiveness of these operations needs to be continuously maintained and streamlined. So generally speaking, when you look at, say, for example, an email response that we need to provide, we normally have a timeline that we need to provide that response within 2 to 3 hours, and that is what needs to be looked at in terms of as a best practice. Because when we look at other competitors and universities, what we generally see is that emails get responded in a day, 2 day, 3 day, 5 day for universities, because they work with a lot of part-time staff and guest lecturers or staff, and that is where the approach tends to be slightly different. So in our case, that is a best practice, that if a student or a learner wants a response and sends us in a query, we are able to respond to that learner pretty quickly, because the guidelines and the processes set by the HR, clearly for the administrative team, tend to follow what is called a best practice model, which means that we are continuously looking at improving our services and thereby differentiating ourselves from the competition, which helps us, meet the requirements of the learners. Now, here, when we recruit staff, we are very clear that the staff has to be highly skilled. They have to have good IT skills, good communication skills, and they need to understand, they need to be troubleshooters. That means if there's a query, if there's a problem, if there's an issue which arises, they should be able to resolve, solve, and offer a solution to the learner. So that is where we follow the best practice model. Now, if we are to look at what strategy and elements of that strategy are used to elements, when I say straight away the bell should ring in your head is when I use the word elements, is the set of activities which HR does that we need to include in the strategy is what we need to look at talking about here. So when it says develop a human resource strategy for a named organization, what are the bits that we look at? So in terms of developing the strategy, we go back to that 5 steps that we discussed earlier. First, we look at SWOT analysis. We look at understanding existing plans. We look at, creation of those plans and approvals. Then we go to implementation. Then we go to monitoring and evaluation. Then we look at refinement and adjustment. And if there are any barriers or obstacles, we discuss, we look at them, and then, readjust the plan to implement it. The same set of factors would be coming here when the strategy is formed. So first thing which HR looks at, although we are essentially an online organization, but we are dispersed in a lot of locations. So we look at location of operations. When I say locations, because we have a digital presence and we are present in 6 or 7 different countries, we have staff in some countries which work part-time. They are in different time zones, and that would give us a big challenge to manage the times and the time zones for the staff to be able to work. So in some cases, this tends to be one of the key things that we have to consider when we are taking on new staff, or obviously putting a new plan in place to ensure that everyone is able to, be a part of that plan. And in those cases, because we have dispersed staff and we have staff working in different time zones, we need to look at locations as one of the key factors that we consider for building the strategy. Then we look at availability of technology, because most of the delivery is online. So in such cases, I'm going into the detailing of discussing this from a named organization perspective, because we operate mostly online. And in such cases, infrastructure in terms of bandwidth, connectivity, IT, laptop, Mac, and things like that needs to be 100% available with all staff and employees. And they should be good in terms of usage and working knowledge of IT. And that could include HRM systems, that could include CRM systems, that could include e-learning platforms, and obviously in general, the use of IT, things like Microsoft Office software, Zoom, or web meeting softwares and things like that. Then, because we have workers who work, or staff who essentially work in different locations, some of them work part-time, some of them work on certain days, some of them start at a different time. By the time we start in Manchester, their timing in terms of operations would have been over. So one of the key criteria which HR puts into its strategies, the point of productivity. So most workers, or most of my staff, essentially independently work. They have a very high sense of responsibility and ownership in terms of their role within the organization and the job they do. And they have very clear job descriptions in terms of what they need to accomplish on a daily basis, weekly basis. And that allows the productivity side of things to be driven when we look at, on organizational strategy from a point of view of, people being able to contribute towards the goals or meeting the objectives. And that is what is then stressed on within the HR job descriptions and key performance indicators and performance appraisals at the end of the quarter or at the end of the year when they are evaluated. Then we look at competition, which could be one of the things that we have to look at essentially in terms of how the competition is offering, what they are offering, their pricing, and things like that. And then we go into some of the other elements of the strategy, which is things like employee development. We look at training and development, which is required, where in some areas, if there is any contraction happening in the business, that is then translated into some sort of a HR strategy to say we would need to manage these employees, redeploy some of the existing staff that we have trained over the years to help take up other functions rather than make them redundant. Looking at growth side of things, which is an organizational strategy, but how does this translate into an HR strategy? Here, the growth would be that if we are looking at expanding into the Middle East market, we are looking at recruiting 2 or 3 people. The HR side of things would be then looking at, understanding what are the growth requirements, what are the revenue requirements, what is the bottom line which the revenue would produce from that geography. And that is where how compensation and recruitment side of things tends to happen when HR recruits people within that geography. And then you also understand financial implications. You understand skills requirement, and they would then all become a part and parcel of your, HR plan that you're trying to put together, or the strategy that you're trying to put together. Now, in terms of the elements that we are going to look at, these are the elements that we discussed that would need to be looked at from a point of view of planning of HR set of activities in the HR strategy. So recruitment and selection always tends to be of people which are, which I would say would be people who are highly talented, highly motivated, enthusiastic, and have some sort of an experience and background in, say, higher education or delivery of higher education courses. And they are in general very good with the use of IT. And then we look at, so in our case, when I look at the elements of strategy, we might consider 4 or 5 elements. Obviously, recruitment and selection is always ongoing. We want to look at people who are willing to learn in terms of taking up new skills. So learning and development is important throughout the duration of their working within the organization. Then performance management and evaluation, along with engagement with other members of the, I would say other members within the team is very important. So the organizational culture, the HR looks at when they recruit somebody is to look at people who can work within teams, can work independently, but can also work within teams. they are able to work remotely and also work within roles wherein which requires very little supervision. So in those cases, the idea there is that the organization, and in this case, the HR part of the organization essentially looks at recruitment part of it, wherein they would look at employees which are highly motivated and they would engage with have a good understanding of their role, but also engage when they are able to work within teams. When they're asked to work within teams, they're able to engage with other employees and colleagues within the organization. And then any HR department, if you have to retain the talent, you have to always look at, making sure your compensation and benefits are in line with the market. You're meeting some of the government legislation side of things. And one of the other things that we proud ourselves as an organization is that the HR looks at implementing diversity and inclusion. So we're an organization which has employees or staff from various facets of different, geography, different cultures, different backgrounds, and that shows an organization which is quite diverse, and it is quite inclusive because we have employees with different faiths, different cultural background, coming from different locations, and they all tend to work very well within the organization. And that is where you would essentially show how you develop a human resource strategy within a named organization. So talk about the planning part of it. And once the plan part of it has been done, then we need to go into the elements of what part of the elements of human resource strategy can be used, which are basically required to create the successful working of a strategy within the organization. Now, in order to give a very different example, I've taken up a fictitious organization like Tech Vantage Solutions, and I've drawn up a small table, which is more or less a plan, which is a detailed plan, but in a tabular format to give you a bird's eye view or a snapshot of how an HR plan would look like. Now, this plan, which we've discussed in slide, might be detailed plan which the HR would have or the HR people would have. But if I have to look at providing something to the management would be interested in looking at this. Okay, you formed up a plan for the year. Then what are the things that HR will implement? What part of it would be the activities that you implement, and what are the elements coming into play would be detailed out as a time or a timeline or a table which the management or the board of the organization would be interested in. So this is again a snapshot of what kind of activities you plan in the HR strategy side of what your HR strategy consist of. Then what are the activities that you would do in that strategy plan, and then a bit of description, timeline to indicate that how long will that activity last, and the milestone which basically indicates what is it that you would achieve at the end of successful completion of that step or that particular activity. That is something which will allow the management or the board to look at, or the director or the chief executive of the organization to essentially evaluate whether the plan is working or not and ask for any corrections to be done. So things like the strategy would include, you do an audit. In some cases, instead of SWOT, I would now use a word called audit to see if there is the HR plan or strategy is there within an organization. Then you look at if there is a strategic plan, but it is old or it is outdated, then you would look at developing a new strategy. Then the strategy would go into detailing of one of the activities of HR which it is looking at doing, and that is of most importance. And in this case, I've taken an example of that. The organization is looking at talent acquisition. That means it's looking at implementing a recruitment plan in general for this year, and that would be the main part of the strategic plan when we look at HR side of things. Now, in along with the recruitment, the HR would also need to look at, obviously you're trying to bring new employees in, offer them new roles and objectives in terms of salary and other bits. Then existing employees would also be looking at how do we look at increasing our engagement, our increase in salary. We have been with the organization for that long and things like that. So employee retention and engagement would also go hand in hand with that strategy. The HR at some point in time, when they bring new people in, which are coming in at new pay scales and new grades, essentially would mean that the HR would need to look at existing pay scale and salaries to ensure that they don't have an attrition in terms of people leaving the organization or existing staff which has been working leaving the organization, saying that okay, the new staff coming in gets more salary, why do we get less? And those kind of troubles you would need to avoid. So that would become a part and parcel of the strategy of the HR part of the plan that you create. And then looking at training development, which is in the case of TechVantage Solutions, because it's a technological company which provides solutions to its IT customers, IT company providing solutions to its customers. We look at how the HR part of things can be streamlined within the organization. Is there an HR platform or a software which allows leave management, payroll, say for example, grievances or other aspects of that to be captured? And then if this is being implemented for the first time, then a bit of training and development needs to be done. And obviously, once the system is in place and the strategy has been put in place, at some stage you would look at review and a monitoring of that plan to see whether it's working or not. And if it starts to work, if there are no adjustments required, then this plan is then implemented year after year with maybe some change of strategic options in terms of what it wants to implement, and that becomes a planning side of things and a strategy side of things for the organization. So this is maybe an example of how do you develop a plan in a named organization and explain what are the main parts of the plan and what are the elements of the plan which needs to be used or would be put into action by HR in order to achieve a particular organizational goal. Any questions on this?
Some parts of this plan are always continuous, right?
Yes, some part of these plans could be always continuous, yes, because when I look at, say, just recruitment and selection, you won't probably, recruit and you find the right set of people at the same point in time. You might continuously keep on recruiting throughout the year. And that would be adding to that part of the strategy that, okay, one of the bits was that we had to increase headcount. Sometimes you find people in one go, sometimes you don't, and you keep continuing with that activity till you find them. So some parts of the plan could be ongoing, definitely. Reviewing and monitoring as an aspect, once the basic set of strategic plan has been put in place and has been implemented, that would be an ongoing process. So review and monitoring generally tends to be ongoing. Adjustment and refinement in the plan if things are not working the way they were anticipated, or if barriers and obstacles are coming, they would be set of activities which will be ongoing. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Now let's go into the second criteria, which talks about proposed human resource strategy to support and achieve, to help in the supporting and achievement of business objectives. Now here, what we are saying is once you've drawn up a plan, how do you show that it helps in the achievement of business objectives? Now, one of the things, again, following up with the named organization that you've taken, you need to follow it through for this part of the assessment criteria as well. So in this case, for example, if you were looking at expanding into one or two locations this year and next year, how would that plan which HR has put in place help in the achievement of the organizational strategy? Say, for example, growth and revenue targets. So the detailing of this particular assessment criteria is focused on ensuring and showing what sets of HR strategy that you have formed help in the achievement of the organizational strategy in short to medium to long term. So again, one of the things that we look at in general when you have to compare two strategies. So the organizational strategy is the overarching, strategy of the organization, but that is broken down into different strategies in different departments. So engineering, marketing, sales, HR, finance will have their own strategy. But all of these, it's like a bit of a, let's say a jigsaw puzzle. So all the strategies have to achieve and help in achievement of the overarching strategy of the organization. Now, in order to ensure that this happens and all the pieces fit into place or fall into place to help achieve the overall goal, you would start looking at whether the plan created by HR is aligned with the objectives of the organizational plan or not. So the most important thing is to basically look at, let's say, if I use the word, um, interpreting the main goals and objectives which the board, management, chief executive sets, and then that interpretation of the objectives need to lead to micro activities or micro side of planning in usual or in the, I would say, departmental activities. And those set of micro planning of the activities or breaking down into smaller activities would, when each of these are completed, would help in achieving the overall activities or the goals of the organization. So the most important bit that we look at is the plan which has been created by HR aligned with the strategic and business objectives of the organization or not. So to give you an example here, if we were looking at, as an example which I've taken, is that if an organization is looking at expanding its outlets or its number of locations in terms of business, then one of the clear things the HR would need to understand is that if they are expanding to different locations, this would mean increase in the number of headcount. Then they would need to understand what is the number of headcounts which need to be put into place in that location to run that location as an independent operation or as a business unit. And then for that business unit, what is the end objective in terms of revenue goal, bottom line goal, for it to be able to achieve and contribute towards the overall goal, revenue goal of the organization. Now, the HR would need to go into a lot of detailed planning to understand, and here is where I looked at an example of Subway as a bit of a example, because if you look at they expanding into 10 locations in Manchester, assuming the HR works with the let's say the procurement and purchase department, because they are the ones which will be looking at location, venue, or rentals, or hires, or long-term leasing. They would be the commercial part of the transaction. But once they've taken the place, then they look into fitters and all that stuff and the construction of it or fitting of it. And once that is done, the HR is primarily side by side working on understanding the workforce requirements for that location. Now, in a typical Subway shop, you would see there are 2, 3 employees or 2, 3, or 4 employees, depending on the size and the scale of that particular location. Now, if that location has seating arrangements, you would probably have more staff. But if it is only a smaller location wherein customers step in, take an order, and obviously take it or essentially have it delivered or take it out for eating, then in such cases you might have 1 or 2 staff. So if they understand the staffing requirements and what is it and when will that outlet be ready and would need that staff, they would put that plan they would start to put that plan in place. So if the outlet has been acquired on a long-term lease, it needs now fitting and refurb, which is being done, which will take 2 months. And then after that, once it is ready, it will need stocking, which will take another 2 weeks or whatever. And then some part of the staff in terms of opening the outlet, training and development. And this is what the HR would need to put into some sort of a timeline. So their role and function would start with recruitment, maybe at the same time as what the fitting in the location is happening. And that would give them a couple of weeks for the staff to be able to join and then start training and development in another outlet to understand how the operations of the outlet have to be run. And different people will go undergo different sorts of training. And by the time this outlet starts, from day one, you'll have the staff which is trained. They've had hands-on, experience of working within various tills and terminals and various aspects of it, and that store would start its operation without a hitch. Now, in such cases, this part of the planning would be the basic set of planning which HR would do. But at the end of it, they extrapolate this into 12 months of planning to see what kind of revenue, footfall, turnover which the store will actually contribute. And they will work in turn with the sales and marketing department to understand a new store, what kind of promotions will be run, what kind of budget outlets are being spent on, and then what is the expected customer footfalls that store will bring. And then marketing would look at various side of things in terms of tie-up, going on to Uber Eats, Deliveroo, this and that, which would also augment the sales of the organization in terms of takeaway orders which are happening. Now, all this side of planning would make the HR side of plan the HR side of planning would need to include very good understanding of these activities. Now, if they are not aligned with the understanding on these activities, there is a possibility that some part of the process of how they recruit, train, and develop employees to work within their outlet would not go well. And in those cases, it would not contribute or maybe look at a slow start or not do the contributions it is expected to do as a new store working within an area. So it is important for the proposed strategy that the organization has, that HR needs to understand that strategy in full, understand it with timelines, implications, and once they understand that, they need to look at aligning and creating their plans in a way which complement that strategy rather than and work with that strategy to be able to help achieve it rather than being counterproductive or being reactive. So alignment of the HR strategic plan with the business objectives is the first most important part. The second part is they need to have a very good understanding of what are the external factors which will play into this strategy. And these external factors would be government legislation and compliance. Now, it could be demand and supply of labor. That means in some locations, if it's a new location and it's a new area which is coming up, it's less populated or sparsely populated, then in such cases, you might have staff not willing to take up employment or relocating internal staff to such location for the purposes of maybe promotional opportunities or requirements might not work. So they would need to look at, managing the workforce and the recruitment of the workforce and their expectations with regards to that particular area. And in some cases, sometimes it does happen that the first year of operations would be subsidized by profits from the organization. The first year of operations would primarily provide lower targets. The first year of operations in that location might also mean that the staff gets higher compensation because the footfall is low, but they are doing their hours and they're doing their bit in terms of working within that outlet in order to drive business. So in such cases, these are exigencies which the HR has to plan because they are not within the control of their organization, but they are affected from external factors, which would be in play or coming into play for that location or for that particular outlet which is opened up. And then there is continuous monitoring, as we've discussed in terms of one of the elements of the plan. And monitoring would be on performance indicators, looking at, review of some of the qualitative and quantitative measures. Some of the qualitative measures tend to be things like the, footfall which is happening in the organization, or in terms of customers, looking at the size and scale of the orders, or, whether it's, when I say size and scale of the order, what is the average revenue or average order revenue which the store is getting as compared to some of the other stores. So they will go into what are called very clear indicators and compare some of these indicators of business vis-a-vis some of the other stores which are well established to benchmark against some of the activities which are happening in that location. And they would then look at coming up or looking at finding out the sources wherein there are issues or problems and how they can be streamlined proactively rather than reactively. And then these indicators would provide a very good, let's say, insight into whether this store and the store plans are working or not, whether this would contribute to revenue or revenues indicated to the bottom line of the company at the end of the year or not. And that would be an example of how you would look at evaluating by going into let's say, looking into key performance indicators, external factors, and obviously looking at the aspects of whether the alignment of the plan and the plan which has been put in place meets the organizational objectives or not. And that part is what we need to look at covering in the second assessment criteria to see whether the HR side of things and plans that HR creates on the basis of organizational strategy and plans, are they helping in the achievement of the objectives of the increased revenue in this case as an example for the organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this?
No questions.
Okay, we'll go into the last assessment criteria, which is now talking about some of the hurdles or barriers which can be, impediments to or raise issues or problems at some stage with the implementation of the HR strategy. So here is where we would talk about things which are basically related to, issues or problems which can come up when the HR strategy is being implemented. So if you think of in general, when we put a plan in place, what are the kind of various issues that you can face in putting that plan into action? So some of these plan, issues can be financial issues. Let's say, for example, if a conservative budgeting has been done for expansion, as against the anticipated rise in costs, which is happening because of the rise of living costs, or, for example, external changes in the market, then financially constraints generally come up because you've done conservative budgeting for planning something, but at some stage these budgets get expanded or need to be expanded in order to meet the required objectives. There could be issues in terms of larger organizations. Sometimes when compensation plans or increases in salaries are discussed year on year, like in the UK, just as an example, in the UK, obviously we had doctors striking, nurses striking, teachers striking, university lecturers striking last year because some of these jobs are public sector jobs, and because of the cost of living crisis, the government was proposing 3%, 4% rise in salaries, whereas the actual cost of living had increased because of higher inflation, with up to, it had gone up by about 10 to 12%. So most of these organizations, people working within the public sector organizations, decided to do a union action wherein they, wherein they did a balloting, and obviously the balloting said that we will strike and we will request or basically demand a higher salary increase, which is in line with the market conditions. And in such cases, when you look at this being, a balloting action happening and strikes happening, this is basically a very major hurdle which the services face when it leads to disruption because of strikes and union action. So in such cases, there the talks between the government and obviously various unions and the HR representatives or the representatives of the organization typically tend to happen to diffuse this, and in such cases you would see this becomes a potential barrier or a big obstacle for services to be delivered, say within the NHS to the members of public. So when these strikes and actions happen, and obviously now it's been settled that doctors and nurses got, I think, a 10% pay rise for next 2 years or 3 years, and that is what was recommended by the talks which happened. But what happened within that time frame is a lot of operations and a lot of procedures which were supposed to be done were put forward because of strikes and non-availability of staff. So in such cases, this has created a bit of a backlog in terms of operations within the NHS. So when you look at potential barriers, these tend to be barriers which are bigger barriers that, in larger organizations, the HR has to mitigate and proactively anticipate that this could lead to a problem. And that is where they need to sensitize the management of the board to say that before we look at making a decision, we need to do sometimes what is called consultations with the employees internally to look at making sure that the decisions being done or taken are in line with the market conditions and have a buy-in from the employees. So here is where we generally talk about issues which can come, and financial issues is one of them. Trade unions or balloting action is one of them. Sometimes you look at skill shortage in the market. If recruitment and selection has to be done, compensation and remuneration as compared to what the company is offering is higher or lower than essentially what the market conditions desire and what competitors are offering, and that could be a barrier or an obstacle which would not allow the recruitment and selection process to happen. Resistance to change is one of the key things that you get to see within organizations when organizations look at bringing across a policy change or a procedural change within the working of the organization. And that tends to be one of the clear things that you can relate to is if organization picks up or looks at adapting technology or a change which will bring in automation within the organization of a certain part of process. And that is where you generally see sometimes people are averse to not accepting that change. And that resistance to change can lead to lower morale, lower productivity, and obviously disengagement of employees because they get into a lot of other things like gossip and, for example, discussions and consultations, which can obviously bring down the productivity of the organization. Then you also think of any sort of other barriers which could be in place, things like poor communication in the structure of the organization between the top to the bottom. If decision making power is not decentralized in certain areas of functioning of the organization, that could create a problem. You look at lack of alignment of the objectives. If they are not being translated on very clear, or they are ambiguous, if I may put it this way, that the objectives being translated into job descriptions and key performance indicators from the organizational strategy to the employee part of it, if they're ambiguous or they are open to interpretation, then that creates a lack of alignment of that strategy within the organization. And that would also create a bit of discontent, confusion, and obviously inefficiency in terms of understanding what are the key objectives to achieve, what are the key objectives which have to be managed and achieved at the end of the day. And that understanding might be diluted because there is a non-alignment of the, or maybe disparity in terms of the alignment of the organizational strategy with the HR strategy. And then you could look at all the other types of barriers, which could be barriers which are external, to the organization. So a lot of this confusion around increase in salaries and the cost of living crisis, had an impact from outside because a lot of organizations were discussing, and it had a bit of a cascading reaction in different organizations. So it started off with doctors and nurses, went into teachers and university lecturers, then went into other public sector jobs, wherein everybody started demanding this. So this kind of thing sometimes tends to be a cascade which happens because the market conditions are such, and in such cases, the HR is, tasked with the responsibility of managing this by starting consultation processes in advance, because they should be able to sense what is happening in the market and the market conditions, and they could potentially then pose obstacles or barriers for the implementation of a strategy within the organization. And in such cases, the HR has to have a reactive, rather than a reactive, a proactive approach by starting consultation processes to avoid such action happening within the organization. So here is a list of potential barriers that are put together as a table, which would allow you to understand that what are these barriers, what these barriers essentially create as problems when we look at HR strategy, and then what kind of an impact it can have on the implementation of the strategy of the organization and the HR part of it, when we consider them having an overall effect in terms of workings of the organization. But generally speaking, sometimes what happens is, if I give an example, that if there is a change which has been brought in, that okay, a change is organization is looking at saving, say, for example, say high street costs. That means relocation of an office from one particular location to another, because it is able to save a lot of costs in terms of rentals and leasing. Now, if that is a situation which happens, the HR role becomes quite important, is because if you see that relocation is going to happen within a couple of meters or couple of blocks within the same area, that should be manageable. But if it is happening to a different location altogether, like for example, if the company decides that real estate costs in Dubai have become quite expensive, they want to relocate the offices of the organization from Dubai to Abu Dhabi, which is considered 30 to 40, 30 to 50% cheaper than Dubai. Now, in such cases, the distance between Abu Dhabi and Sharjah, or Abu Dhabi and Dubai, is about 35 kilometers. That would mean people working within Dubai or staying within Dubai or having residences within Dubai would need to travel to Sharjah or Abu Dhabi, and that would include a commute of an hour and a half during peak hours. Now, that would not go down well with some of the employees. Now, in such cases, this change which the company is doing to save costs might not go well with the employees. And what will tend to happen is a couple of things would happen in the organization. Some of the employees would start finding a job within Dubai or within another organization or a competitor. Some of the employees would start getting into discussions to say this should not be done, and there are informal gossips and conversations would begin to happen, and that would basically impede or decrease productivity in the organization. People who are generally motivated would also get into the discussion and can lead to morale of the employees going down. In some cases, this would also mean that some employees would start maybe participating or having discussions which could have a negative impact on other employees within the organization, which might be more in line and tune with the changes which are happening and would support it. So lots of different things could happen. And in such cases, the role of HR tends to be quite important, because what they would do is basically start structuring out a process of communication, start sending out communications in a way to highlight benefits, advantages, adjustments which it would allow employees to do. And in some cases, say for example, also look at helping the employees to relocate by offering relocation packages, because the HR would not want to lose its workforce or people which have been skilled, trained, and developed within the organization to leave, and then having to start going into a recruitment and selection strategy. So in such cases, you would look at acceptance to change, low morale or dissatisfaction amongst employees starting to look at opportunities outside and not willing to engage with HR in terms of any sort of a consultation, would all become potential barriers for relocation of the offices from one location to the other. And that is what you need to think of as an example to discuss in terms of understanding what these potential barriers could be and how they could limit the implementation of, say, the HR strategy or the organizational goals because because of, say, for example, some of these obstacles, hurdles, or barriers which the organization and employees feel that they are facing. And in their case, they are not looking at engaging in discussions, but obviously looking at making their own decisions in terms of how they would deal with that change. And that is what needs to be discussed with regards to this assessment criteria. Is that okay? Any
Yes.
questions on this?
No.
Okay, good stuff. Now, in terms of reading, additional reading, what I've done is I'm going to put in one or two very good articles that you could understand. And one is how to write an HR plan. This is one of the bits that I would recommend that you look at. The other bits that I'm going to look at putting in place would be, a particular article which talks about the role of HR in business partnering. And this is because the HR side of things and functions that they carry out actually are seen to be a part and parcel of how they support the organizational strategy. And in order to understand this side of the things, what we have to look at is understand why HR department in general is considered, a partner in the business strategy, because they help influence how people would essentially participate in playing their part to help the organization achieve its goal. So the concept of business partnering is basically a CIPD article, which is the Chartered Institute of Professional Development in the UK. And this particular article, a couple of paragraphs, I would suggest would be a good reading, to understand what role does HR play and how is the role of HR strategy seen in helping the organization achieve its goal, because they are treated as a partner, an effective partner essentially, which is going to help in the implementation of the organizational strategy. So these two bits I would suggest would be the additional reading to help understand this learning outcome in detail, along with this video in terms of what is an HR strategy, an introduction to it, and how to develop one for a named organization when you start to look at doing the assignment next week. Is that okay?
Okay, thank you. And if you have any questions, we can ask you on the
Definitely, yes. You can ask me by the email route, not an issue at all. And what I will do is I will put this, bit in terms of the presentation on Moodle along with the copy of this recording, so that if you need to revisit anything, that would be available to you, for you to revisit. And we'll meet up next week to discuss the assignment, for this particular unit. And that will hopefully bring this unit to a close next week.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for attending, and bye for now.
Bye.